December 7, 1941. 7:55 a.m. The sky over Oahu is a bruised lavender, the air smelling of salt spray and the sweet, heavy scent of tropical hibiscus. Below the tranquil surface of Pearl Harbor, the water is still, a mirror reflecting the massive, grey silhouettes of the Pacific Fleet. On the deck of the USS West Virginia, the morning ritual has begun. The clinking of coffee mugs, the soft thud of boots on steel, the distant sound of a bugle. Then, a low drone, like a swarm of angry hornets, begins to vibrate in the iron of the hull. It is the sound of the world ending. Within minutes, the first long-lance torpedo, a marvel of Japanese engineering, tears through the port side with a scream of rending metal. 6 more follow. The pride of the American mountains, a 33,000-ton titan of steel, is not just hit, she is being erased. As the black oil gushes into the turquoise sea, the West Virginia groans, tilting violently, her decks becoming a slick, fire-swept slaughterhouse. By noon, she is a scorched carcass resting on the mud of the harbor floor, her superstructure a twisted crown of thorns emerging from a sea of flame. To the Japanese aviators looking down from their cockpits, the conclusion was mathematical and absolute. The Wee-Vee was dead. In the mahogany-paneled war rooms of Tokyo, the Imperial Japanese Naval General Staff looked at the reconnaissance photographs with a sense of divine triumph. Admiral Yamamoto had promised to paralyze the American giant, and the images of the West Virginia, settled deep in the silt, her internal compartments flooded with millions of gallons of seawater, suggested a victory that transcended mere tactical success. It was a psychological execution. To the Japanese mind, steeped in the Bushido code and the aesthetics of finality, a sunken ship was a corpse. The ocean was a graveyard from which there was no resurrection. They believed that by destroying the physical iron, they had shattered the American will. They saw the United States as a nation of soft merchants, consumers of luxury who lacked the spiritual fortitude to rebuild what had been broken. The Japanese expected the Americans to sue for peace, to retreat to their west coast, and to leave the Pacific to the rising sun. They did not account for the American religion of the machine. They did not understand that to a nation built on the assembly line and the industrial furnace, a sunken battleship was not a corpse, it was merely raw material awaiting a new shape. While the Japanese celebrated their impossible victory, the Americans began a task that defied the laws of naval history. They did not see a wreck, they saw a challenge of engineering. The salvage of the West Virginia was an epic of mud and grit, a descent into a subterranean hell of oil-soaked darkness. Divers, clad in heavy copper helmets, crawled through the jagged holes in her hull, working by touch in water thick with the stench of decomposing rations and fuel. They patched over 80 feet of ruptured steel under the surface. They pumped out the Pacific Ocean, gallon by agonizing gallon. As the water receded, the ship began to groan, the buoyancy returning to her iron bones like a slow, mechanical heartbeat. The Japanese had predicted it would take a decade to replace such a vessel. The Americans did not replace her. They healed her. They scraped away the barnacles of defeat and the soot of the Pearl Harbor fires. They stripped her to the studs and rebuilt her with the fury of a nation that had moved from peace to total war in a single heartbeat. The transformation was not merely physical, it was ideological. The ship that emerged from the dry docks of Puget Sound 2 years later was not the ship that had sunk in 1941. She was a ghost clad in modern armor. Her old lattice masts were gone, replaced by streamlined towers bristling with the latest radar arrays, the eyes of democracy that could see through the thickest fog and the darkest night. She was now a floating fortress of anti-aircraft fire, her decks packed with 40mm Bofors and 20mm Oerlikon guns, a metallic porcupine designed to swat the divine wind out of the sky. But the most symbolic change was found in the mess decks. Among the sailors, a recurring sound began to define their new reality, the rhythmic, mechanical hum of the ice cream machine. To the Japanese sailor, surviving on meager rations of rice and pickled plums, the idea of an American ship having the electrical power and the luxury to produce cold, sweet ice cream in the middle of a tropical war zone was incomprehensible. That sound, the churning of sugar and cream, represented a civilization so abundant, so industrially superior, that it could fight a world war with one hand and provide comforts to its sons with the other. The ice cream was more than food, it was a symbol of the very freedom and prosperity the Japanese had sought to extinguish. The Pacific Theater in 1944 was a landscape of attrition, a relentless grinding of material and men across thousands of miles of salt water. The Japanese strategy relied on the decisive battle, a singular, cataclysmic clash where their superior spirit would overcome American steel. They envisioned a grand duel where the samurai spirit of the Yamato and Musashi would sweep the sea clean. What they found instead was the terrifying efficiency of the American shipyard. For every ship the Japanese lost, the Americans produced 10. For every pilot shot down, the American training pipeline delivered 100. The logistical tail of the United States Navy was longer and more robust than anything history had ever seen. On the West Virginia, now fully modernized, the sailors didn't just carry shells, they carried the weight of an entire continent's industrial output. The ship was no longer just a weapon, it was a floating factory, a city of steel that produced its own water, its own electricity, and its own hope. The hum of the ice cream machine, once a minor comfort, had become a psychological weapon. Sailors from destroyers and PT boats would pull alongside the massive battleship, begging for a scoop of vanilla or chocolate. It was a sign of a nation that could afford the unnecessary. In the Japanese fleet, every ounce of fuel and every gram of calories was measured with desperate precision. Their sailors were taught that suffering was a virtue, that the absence of comfort was proof of their purity. But as the West Virginia steamed back into the combat zones, her crew was nourished by the calories of a booming heartland. The contrast was stark, one side fought for a dying empire of scarcity, while the other fought with the inexhaustible resources of a continent-sized democracy. This abundance was the impossible made manifest. It was the realization that the United States had not just recovered from the blow at Pearl Harbor, it had used that blow as a catalyst to transform itself into a global titan. The climax of this resurrection came on the night of October 25, 1944, in the Surigao Strait. The Japanese Southern Force, led by the battleship Yumashiro, steamed into the narrow waters, confident in their night-fighting prowess. They believed they were hunting the remnants of a beaten navy. They did not know that waiting in the darkness was a ghost they had killed 3 years prior. The West Virginia, guided by her new electronic eyes, watched the Japanese approach from 30,000 yards away. The Japanese admirals, peering through binoculars, saw nothing but shadows. They relied on their vision, on their instincts, on the moon. The Americans relied on the invisible pulses of electricity bouncing off Japanese steel. At 3:53, the Wee-Vee spoke. Her 16-inch guns, the very ones that had been submerged in the mud of Pearl Harbor, unleashed a synchronized salvo that tore through the night like a physical wall of heat. The first shell struck the Yumashiro squarely on the bridge. It was the last battleship-versus-battleship action in history. The ship that could not be raised was now the executioner of the Imperial Navy. As the Yumashiro slipped beneath the waves, the Japanese sailors realized too late that they weren't fighting men, they were fighting a relentless, self-renewing machine of liberty. The fire that had consumed the West Virginia in 1941 had been tempered into a cold, lethal efficiency. The revenge of the Wee-Vee was not a hot-blooded rage, but a cool, calculated demonstration of technical superiority. The Japanese admirals, staring at the radar-directed salvos that arrived with mathematical precision, finally understood that the corpse had not only risen, but it had learned to see in the dark. The myth of Japanese night fighting invincibility vanished in a hail of 2,000-pound shells. The battle was short, brutal, and final. It was the moment the Pacific War shifted from a contest of wills to a foregone conclusion of logistics and technology. The West Virginia story continued through the brutal campaigns of Iwo Jima and Okinawa. She became the old reliable of the fleet, her massive guns providing the rolling thunder that cleared the way for the Marines on the beaches. She endured kamikaze attacks, her crew fighting fires with the same practice calm they had learned in the oily waters of Pearl Harbor. They knew the ship could survive. They had seen her at the bottom of the sea, and they knew that as long as the hull held and the guns fired, they were invincible. The ship had become a symbol for the entire Navy, a reminder that no matter how deep the wound, the American spirit possessed a unique capacity for repair. The epilogue of the West Virginia is written in the silence of the deep and the noise of the factory. Her journey from the mud of Oahu to the surrender ceremony in Tokyo Bay is a testament to the fact that freedom is not just a philosophy, but a physical force of renewal. The Japanese had sought to kill a ship, but they only succeeded in forging a weapon of vengeance. They mistook American abundance for weakness, failing to see that a nation that can afford to give its soldiers ice cream in a wasteland is a nation that will never run out of the iron or the will to defend its shores. The West Virginia rose because the ideology that built her does not accept finality. It believes in the constant labor of improvement and the inevitable triumph of the light over the shadow. In the end, the impossible was not the resurrection of a ship, but the idea that a free people could ever be truly defeated. As long as the furnace burns and the hammer falls, the ghost of the West Virginia reminds us that what is sunk in darkness can always be raised in the dawn of a new and enduring freedom. To truly comprehend the resurrection of the USS West Virginia, one must understand the depth of the grave she occupied. By the evening of December 7, the battleship was a tomb of iron. The fires had burned so hot that the steel of her upper decks had warped like candle wax. Beneath the waterline, her hull was shredded, a jagged labyrinth of ruin where over 100 men had drawn their final breath. The Japanese command looked at the aerial photographs of the Wee-Vee and saw a permanent monument to American decline. In the strategic calculus of the Imperial Navy, a ship that has settled into the silt is no longer a factor in the war. They believed the Pacific was now theirs to shape, and that the American industrial heart was too far away, too slow, and too divided to ever bridge the gap between the bottom of a harbor and the surface of the sea. But in the weeks following the attack, the silence of Pearl Harbor was replaced by a different kind of sound. It was not the sound of mourning, but the sound of the welder's arc and the massive, rhythmic thud of industrial pumps. The salvage effort was led by men who refused to accept the finality of the Japanese victory. They worked in a toxic soup of salt water, heavy fuel oil, and the debris of a shattered piece. Divers spent thousands of hours in the pitch-black interior of the ship, navigating by touch through flooded corridors where every jagged piece of steel was a potential death trap. They weren't just patching holes, they were performing a miracle of forensic engineering. The Japanese expected a surrender. What they got instead was the American salvage and repair service. This was the first great shock to the imperial system, the realization that for the United States, destruction was merely a temporary state of disrepair. To the Japanese, who viewed their own ships as extensions of the emperor's divine will, beautiful, fragile, and irreplaceable, this American pragmatism was baffling. The Americans treated the West Virginia like a broken locomotive in a rail yard. If it could be bolted, welded, or pumped, it could be made to fight again. This was the ideological divide, a culture of fatalism meeting a culture of relentless, mechanical optimism. As the months turned into years, the impossible became a matter of routine. By early 1942, the West Virginia was floated. By 1943, she was undergoing a metamorphosis in the dry docks of the Pacific Northwest. The ship was literally cut apart and reassembled. Thousands of tons of old, Obsolete equipment were discarded. In their place, the Americans installed the nervous system of the future. The recurring hum of the ice cream machine, which had become a staple of the American naval experience, served as the steady heartbeat of this new construction. It was a constant reminder to the crew that they were backed by a nation of limitless dairy, limitless sugar, and limitless steel. The ice cream machine was not a frivolous luxury, it was a statement of logistics. It told the sailor that his country cared about his spirit as much as his ammunition. It told the enemy that the Americans had so much spare capacity that they could refrigerate cream in a furnace. To the Japanese, who were beginning to see their own supply lines wither under the pressure of American submarines, the ice cream machine was a symbol of an economic engine they could never hope to stall. It represented the abundance of democracy, the idea that a free people could outproduce, out-engineer, and outsupply any autocracy on Earth. By 1944, the West Virginia was no longer a victim, she was a predator. When she finally moved toward the Philippines for the Battle of Leyte Gulf, she carried within her the ghosts of December 7. Every sailor on board knew the history. They knew they were walking on a deck that had once been at the bottom of the sea. This gave the crew a grim, unbreakable confidence. They were the men of the ghost ship, and they were hunting the very fleet that had taught them date. The night of October 25 in the Surigao Strait was the final validation of this American persistence. The Japanese Admiral Nishimura, leading the battleship Yumashiro, was a master of traditional naval warfare. He understood T-crossing and the geometry of the big guns. But he did not understand the digital revolution that had taken place inside the West Virginia's hull. As the Yumashiro steamed into the trap, the West Virginia's Mk-8 fire control radar locked onto her with terrifying ease. In the dark, the Americans saw the Japanese with a clarity that felt like divine intervention. The first salvo from the West Virginia at 3:53 a.m. was a moment of historical poetry. The 16-inch shells, forged in the foundries of the American East and carried to the Pacific by the ship that could not be raced, crossed the distance in a high, whistling arc. They didn't just hit the Yumashiro, they dismantled her. The Japanese battleship, the pride of the Imperial Line, was smothered in fire before she even saw her enemy. The West Virginia fired 93 shells that night. Each one was a physical rebuttal to the Japanese claim of superiority. It was the ultimate demonstration of how American technology, fueled by the abundance of a free market, had rendered the old world of naval combat obsolete. Following Surigao Strait, the West Virginia became an indispensable tool of the island-hopping campaign. At Iwo Jima, she sat off the coast, her guns providing a continuous umbrella of fire for the Marines struggling in the volcanic ash. Here, the recurring symbol of American abundance took on another form, the sheer volume of shells. The West Virginia would fire more weight in steel in a single afternoon than many small nations produce in a year. The impossible was now the scale of American ordnance. The Japanese defenders in their caves heard the constant, rhythmic pounding of the 16-inch guns, a sound that never stopped, a sound that promised that the American supply chain would never run dry. During the battle for Okinawa, the West Virginia faced the ultimate test of her new defenses, the kamikaze. The Divine Wind was the final, desperate attempt of a dying ideology to stop the American machine. On April 1, 1945, a Japanese pilot slammed his aircraft into the West Virginia's superstructure. In the past, such a blow might have crippled a ship. But the Wee-Vee was a product of the lessons learned at Pearl Harbor. Her damage control teams, trained in the fires of 1941, had the blaze out in minutes. The ship didn't even leave her station. She continued her bombardment, her guns never falling silent. The Japanese pilot had given his life for a momentary dent in the American iron. The West Virginia responded with more ice cream for the crew and more shells for the shore. The final transformation of the West Virginia was completed when she sailed into Tokyo Bay in August 1945. She was there to witness the formal surrender of the Japanese Empire. As the sun rose over the Japanese capital, the West Virginia sat at anchor, her grey hull gleaming, her flags snapping in the breeze. She was the only ship present at both the start of the war in Pearl Harbor and its end in Tokyo Bay. She was the living proof that the Japanese impossible was nothing more than an American pending. The epilogue of the West Virginia is a reflection on the nature of freedom and its relationship to material abundance. The Japanese believed that spirit alone could win a war. They believed that by destroying the physical artifacts of American power, they could destroy the American soul. They were wrong because they did not realize that in a democracy, the spirit and the machine are one and the same. The ice cream machine, the radar array, the 16-inch gun, and the salvage pump are all expressions of a people who believe that any problem can be solved with enough labor, enough ingenuity, and enough freedom. The West Virginia was scrapped in 1959, her steel melted down to build the cars and skyscrapers of a new, peaceful world. But her legacy remains as a warning to those who mistake a moment of weakness for a permanent defeat. She teaches us that a nation built on the principles of abundance and liberty can be wounded, it can be sunk, and it can be left for dead, but as long as its people remember their original name, it will always rise. The ghost of the Wee-Vee still haunts the dreams of tyrants, reminding them that the impossible is merely a challenge that an American is waiting to solve. Freedom is not just an idea, it is the power to rebuild. It is the hum of the machine in the night, the patch on the hull, and the cold sweetness of a victory earned through the relentless, industrial application of hope. The West Virginia rose because she had to, because a world without her, and the nation she represented, was a world the survivors refused to inhabit. In her resurrection, we find the largest truth of the war, that the light of democracy, once dimmed by the shadows of Pearl Harbor, was destined to return with a brilliance that would reshape the world forever.